China's massive investment in Peru's Chancay port is more than just a business deal, it's a game-changer in Latin America, challenging decades of U.S. influence. What does this mean for global trade, regional security, and the balance of power? Today, we're breaking it all down: why Chancay Port matters, what China's up to, and how the U.S. might respond. Let's get into it. Assessment of strategic importance of Chancay Port. Alright, let's talk about why Chancay Port in Peru matters so much. Imagine a chessboard, and on that chessboard, this port is like a bishop quietly moving into a position where it could affect multiple parts of the game. For China, this isn't just about trade, this is a strategic move, plain and simple. First, think about where Chancay Port is located. Peru sits right along the Pacific Ocean, one of the most important highways for global trade. And this port is being developed with a $3.6 billion investment from a Chinese company. That's not small change, it's a big bet on making this port a key hub connecting South America to Asia, especially to China. This isn't the first time we've seen China do something like this. Remember the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka? China funded it too, and now Sri Lanka owes them so much money that China basically controls the port. That's the kind of playbook we might be seeing here. From an economic angle, this port is set to compete with the Panama Canal. Right now, a lot of goods traveling between South America and Asia have to go through the canal, which costs time and money. But with Chancay, China is creating a direct route to their markets. It's a logistical dream for them, and for Peru, it's a chance to get its goods, like copper, to Asia faster. China already buys about 30% of Peru's exports, mostly minerals. This port will make that relationship even tighter. But let's think beyond trade. Ports like these are often dual-use, meaning they can be commercial and military. On the surface, it's all about containers and cargo ships, but tomorrow, it could be a base for Chinese Navy vessels. If that happens, it's a whole new ballgame. Imagine a scenario where China can keep an eye on, or even control, key shipping lanes in the Pacific. That's a big headache for the US, especially when we've been the dominant player in this region for so long. We also need to think about the message this sends to other countries in Latin America. The US has historically been the big brother in this neighborhood, thanks to the Monroe Doctrine, but China is showing it's willing to step into that role. It's like China is saying, we can be your partner too, and we come with deep pockets. So, the Chancay port isn't just about moving goods, it's a strategic pawn in a much larger game. It strengthens China's hand economically, builds goodwill in Latin America, and potentially gives them a foothold for military operations down the road. It's a bold move, and it's going to force the US to rethink how we approach the region. Immediate US strategic responses. Now, let's talk about how the US could respond to what China is doing with Chancay Port. Think of it like being at a neighborhood block party. China just rolled up with a fancy barbecue setup and is offering free food to everyone. The US can't just stand there watching, it needs to start engaging with the neighbors to remind them who's been there for them all along. Strengthening diplomatic ties with Peru. The first move is to have a heart-to-heart with Peru. The US needs to sit down with Peruvian leaders and ask, what do you really need? If China is offering cash and infrastructure, the US can't just show up with promises, it needs to bring something tangible. For example, we could expand development assistance or partner with them on clean energy projects, areas where the US has a strong track record. Think of how the US stepped up with Mexico during the USMCA renegotiations, finding a way to align mutual interests while addressing their economic priorities. This isn't about shutting Peru out of a relationship with China, that would backfire. Instead, it's about reminding Peru that a partnership with the US comes with stability and shared values, not strings attached. China's Hambantota port deal in Sri Lanka is a perfect cautionary tale. The US can point to it as an example of how easy money can turn into a long-term problem. Stepping up the public messaging game. We also need to make sure Peru and the rest of Latin America see the bigger picture. The US could use platforms like the Organization of American States, OAS, or even bilateral forums to highlight the risks of depending too heavily on China. For instance, the US could showcase how over-reliance on Chinese loans has caused economic issues in other countries, like Zambia, which struggled to repay its debt after massive Chinese investments. But this messaging has to be careful. The US doesn't want to come across as condescending or controlling. Instead, it needs to frame itself as the reliable, long-term partner that's been around for decades. It's like telling a friend, you can borrow from anyone, but don't forget who's been helping you all along without asking for anything in return. Engaging the region through multilateral forums. This isn't just about Peru. The US should rally other countries in Latin America to collectively address the growing influence of China. Think of initiatives like the Summit of the Americas, where regional leaders gather to discuss common issues. The US can use these platforms to propose regional solutions, like joint infrastructure projects funded by multiple nations or backed by the Inter-American Development Bank (IDB). A good example here is how the US pushed for regional security partnerships to address drug trafficking. That same cooperative spirit could be used to develop economic alternatives to China's investments. Why this matters? This isn't just about keeping score in some global competition. It's about maintaining balance. If countries like Peru feel stuck between two giants, they're more likely to lean toward whoever makes the biggest splash. The US needs to show it can offer something better, not just in terms of money but in long-term partnership and shared prosperity. So, while China's got its shiny new port, the US needs to roll up its sleeves and remind Peru and the rest of Latin America who's really looking out for their best interests. It's a mix of diplomacy, storytelling, and action, because that's how you win trust in the long run. Economic and trade countermeasures. When it comes to countering China's moves economically, the US needs to think of itself as the reliable neighborhood mechanic, someone who knows the region's needs, has the right tools, and doesn't overcharge. China might be flashy, but its deals often come with hidden costs. The US can show it's not just about quick fixes but about building something that lasts. Investing in infrastructure alternatives. One clear response is to offer countries like Peru a better deal. The US could ramp up programs like the International Development Finance Corporation, DFC, which provides loans for infrastructure projects without the debt trap concerns tied to many Chinese investments. Think about how the US used the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, to fund sustainable projects in places like El Salvador, focusing on roads and trade logistics. That's the kind of investment that speaks volumes. Instead of saying, don't work with China, the US can say, here's a better way to achieve your goals without giving up control of your assets. It's like offering a friend a loan with no strings attached compared to the flashy lender who ends up owning your house. Expanding free trade agreements. Trade is another area where the US has an edge. Right now, Peru is part of several trade deals with the US, like the US-Peru Trade Promotion Agreement. But these deals could be refreshed to make them even more beneficial. For instance, the US could lower barriers for Peruvian exports like agricultural products or textiles, making it easier for Peru to trade globally without relying so heavily on China. A real-world example is the U.S. Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. It replaced NAFTA with updated terms that modernize trade for all three countries, ensuring fairer rules while strengthening economic ties. A similar approach could work in South America, give them a reason to prioritize partnerships with the US over others. Building regional trade alliances. The US also needs to think bigger, beyond just Peru. It could work to revitalize regional trade groups like the Pacific Alliance, which includes Peru, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. These alliances could focus on building integrated supply chains that compete with China's influence. For example, if Latin American countries work together, they could process and export more of their raw materials locally instead of sending them to China. Take the Quad Alliance in the Indo-Pacific. While primarily a security partnership, it also has an economic dimension, like promoting tech standards and supply chain resilience. The US could encourage a similar cooperative spirit in Latin America, focused on trade and innovation. Promoting private sector involvement. Here's another key move: the US should get its private sector involved. Companies like Amazon, Google, or Tesla could invest in Latin America, creating jobs and showcasing what American business brings to the table. Remember how Tesla announced plans to build a gigafactory in Mexico? Moves like that send a strong signal about long-term economic commitment. The U.S. government could incentivize these companies by offering tax breaks or co-investment opportunities for projects in the region. When private sector money flows in, it creates a ripple effect, boosting local economies while strengthening ties with the U.S. Why it's effective? At the end of the day, it's not just about competing with China dollar for dollar. It's about showing that U.S. partnerships are built on trust and mutual benefit. China might offer shiny new infrastructure, but if the U.S. can create real economic opportunities that empower countries like Peru to stand on their own feet, that's a game changer. It's the difference between giving someone a fish and teaching them how to fish. One's quick, the other's transformative. The key here is to act fast but stay thoughtful. By offering practical alternatives, strengthening trade ties, and encouraging private investment, the U.S. can show Peru and the rest of Latin America that they don't need to put all their eggs in China's basket. Military and security enhancements. If economic and diplomatic strategies are the carrot, then strengthening military ties in the region is the insurance policy. Think of it like securing your home. You don't wait for trouble to arrive at your doorstep. With Chancay Port, China isn't just setting up a commercial operation, it's positioning itself to influence Pacific maritime traffic. The U.S. needs to respond by shoring up its security relationships in Latin America. Maritime security partnerships. The U.S. should step up joint naval exercises with countries in the region. For example, operations like UNITES, an annual multinational maritime exercise led by the U.S., bring together navies from across the Americas. These drills don't just enhance military readiness, they send a message that the U.S. is a committed partner in regional security. Take Colombia, for instance. Its partnership with the U.S. on counter-narcotics operations has been a cornerstone of their relationship. Applying the same kind of collaborative approach to maritime security could help countries like Peru feel reassured about U.S. support. Monitoring dual-use infrastructure. Chancay Port could easily become more than just a commercial hub, it could be used for surveillance or even as a logistics base for Chinese naval operations. The U.S. needs to monitor this closely. Deploying reconnaissance ships, drones, and satellites to keep an eye on shipping activity around the port is critical. For example, the U.S. uses similar strategies in the South China Sea to track Chinese activity around artificial islands. Applying that expertise here would help ensure the region remains a commercial zone, not a militarized one. Expanding defense cooperation. The U.S. can also increase its military assistance programs in Peru. Training programs like those offered under IMET, International Military Education and Training, could be expanded to include more Peruvian officers. These programs aren't just about skills, they're about building relationships. Look at how U.S. training of NATO allies over decades created a level of trust that's hard to match. The same applies to supplying defense equipment. Instead of letting Peru turn to China for military hardware, the U.S. could offer affordable, reliable alternatives, similar to how it provides Black Hawk helicopters to Colombia for counterterrorism efforts. Intelligence and monitoring efforts. When it comes to intelligence, it's all about staying ahead of the curve. If Chancay Port is a chess move, the U.S. needs to figure out what China's next 3 moves might be. Think of it like keeping an ear to the ground in a crowded marketplace, knowing who's coming, who's going, and what they're up to. Tracking port operations. The U.S. could use its technological edge to monitor the activity at Chancay. Tools like geospatial analysis, signal intelligence, and even good old-fashioned human intelligence, HUMINT, can help keep tabs on what's really happening. For example, during the Cold War, U.S. reconnaissance flights over Cuba provided critical insights into missile deployments. A similar approach, though more discreet, could work here to assess whether the port's facilities are being used for non-commercial purposes. Regional intelligence sharing. The U.S. should strengthen partnerships with allies in the region to share intelligence about Chinese activities. Countries like Colombia, Chile, and Brazil are all watching China's moves closely. Creating a regional intelligence sharing network would allow everyone to stay better informed. This could be modeled after the Five Eyes Alliance, US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which has been highly effective in sharing intelligence across continents. A Latin American version could focus on economic and security issues tied to Chinese investments. Long-term strategic objectives. If the US wants to stay ahead, it needs to think long-term. This isn't just about reacting to China's moves, it's about creating a game plan that ensures Latin America sees the US as a partner of choice for decades to come. It's like planting a tree, you won't see the shade tomorrow, but in time, it becomes invaluable. Reducing dependency on China. One of the US's biggest challenges is that many countries in Latin America rely heavily on Chinese investments, especially for infrastructure. The US needs to promote alternatives, like encouraging American companies to invest in the region or partnering with organizations like the World Bank to offer competitive financing. A real-life example is Power Africa, a US-led initiative that brought private and public investments to expand electricity access in Africa. Something similar could be done in Latin America to address infrastructure gaps without creating debt dependencies. Reinforcing the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine has always been about keeping external powers out of the Americas. While it's a centuries-old policy, its core principle still applies: the US needs to protect its neighborhood. By reframing the doctrine for the modern era, focusing on partnerships, not paternalism, the US can reassure Latin American countries that it has their best interests at heart. For instance, during the Cold War, the US worked through programs like the Alliance for Progress to counter Soviet influence in the region. A modern version of this could focus on digital infrastructure, renewable energy, and education. Creating a coalition for democracy and growth. The US could spearhead a coalition of like-minded countries in Latin America that prioritize democratic governance and sustainable economic growth. Think of it like a mini G7 for the Americas. By working together, these countries could reduce their reliance on external powers like China. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the US provided millions of vaccine doses to countries in the region. That kind of visible, impactful aid shows how much the US can bring to the table when it prioritizes relationships. Risks and contingency planning. Of course, nothing is ever simple. Just like any good plan, the US needs to prepare for what could go wrong. Imagine playing a game of cards: you've got a strong hand, but you still need to watch out for the wild cards. Avoiding regional backlash. If the US comes on too strong, it risks pushing countries closer to China. Nobody likes being told who they can or can't partner with. So, the US needs to tread carefully, presenting its actions as supportive rather than restrictive. Take Venezuela as an example. Years of sanctions and diplomatic isolation have driven the country to deepen ties with China and Russia. The US should learn from this by balancing pressure with engagement. Countering Chinese retaliation. China isn't going to sit quietly. If the US makes moves to counter its influence, China could retaliate economically by targeting US-aligned countries with trade restrictions or by ramping up its investments elsewhere in Latin America. For instance, when Australia called for an investigation into COVID-19's origins, China slapped tariffs on Australian exports like wine and beef. The US needs to anticipate similar moves and build resilience among its partners. By combining immediate responses with long-term strategies, the US can manage the risks and stay ahead of China's growing influence. It's about playing the long game, balancing diplomacy, trade, security, and partnerships to remind Latin America why the US is the partner they can trust. So, Chancay Port isn't just another port, it's a strategic move by China, reshaping trade routes, influencing Latin America, and challenging US dominance in its own backyard. The US has options: ramp up diplomacy, boost trade, tighten security, and outlast China with smarter, long-term strategies. The question isn't just what China will do next, it's how the US will play its hand in this global chess match. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over.